Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Marja Nummelin, and I am the Chief Negotiator for Climate Change for Finland and the UNFCCC focal point. It is my pleasure to present the multilateral assessment for Finland this year. Finland is one of the 27 member states of the European Union. First, greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And starting from the greenhouse gas emissions and removal trends from 1990 to 2022, we can see a clear downward trend in emissions. As well, in 2022, emissions decreased by 2.1 million tons of CO2 equivalent from the previous year. The negative values seen here represent the net sink of the land use change, and forests, the so-called LULUCF sector. The energy sector is still the largest emission source, accounting for 72% of total emissions in 2022, and thus the key driver behind the emission trends. In this sector, the emission reductions have been significant. Compared to 1990, the emissions in the energy sector in 2022 were about 38% lower. And then looking at the emission trends from 1990 to 2022 without the LULUCF sector and comparing emissions in 2022 with the emissions in 1990 and also 2021, we can see that there has been a significant 36% emission reduction from the 1990 levels. This corresponds to 25.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The change from 2021 to 2022 is also significant. Total emissions, excluding LULUCF, were reduced by 4%. Emissions from industrial processes and the other product use emissions were reduced most, by 12%, followed by reductions in waste sector by 5% and in energy sector by 4%. Emissions from agriculture remained at the same level as in the previous year. Then coming to the EU compliance architecture. Under the UNFCCC, the EU and its member states committed in 2009 to achieving a joint quantified economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction target of 20% below 1990 level by 2020. It's a joint target with no separate targets for member states. The EU jointly committed to implement its 20% target through binding legislation in the 2020 EU Climate and Energy Package. The 20% emission reduction target has been divided between sectors covered by the EU emissions trading system, the so-called EU ETS, and the sectors under the so-called effort sharing decision, ESD. Emissions under the EU ETS were to be reduced by 21% by 2020 from 2005 level, and emissions under the effort sharing decision by 10% from the 2005 level by 2020 within the EU as a whole. The EU ETS emission reduction target was at the EU level with no member state-specific caps. Binding national targets were set for member states under the effort-sharing decision, which covers sectors such as buildings, agriculture, transport, and waste. The EU has substantially overachieved the 2020 reduction target. In Finland's annual emission allocations under the effort-sharing decision, there is a strong downward trend. Calculated cumulatively, Finland had 0.8 million tons of CO2 equivalent surplus units for the entire 2013-2020 period. Then to the EU 2020 achievement. According to the final reviewed greenhouse gas inventories, the EU has significantly exceeded its 2020 reduction target by reducing its total emissions without LULUCF by 34% from the 1990 level. Emissions from the EU ETS were reduced by 34% and emissions by sectors under the effort sharing decision by 18% compared to 1990 levels. Then let's also look at the situation post-2020. The EU's revised nationally determined contribution, NDC, under the Paris Agreement from 2020 is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 from the 1990 level. In the EU's climate and energy package, the emission reduction obligations are divided between a revised EU ETS, which is an EU-level target, and the non-ETS emissions, which involves member state-level targets. In addition, the LULUCF sector is now part of the member state-level obligations. The EU legislation sets the framework for Finland's climate and energy targets. Our national targets under the EU legislation are more stringent than the EU average. In the non-ETS sector, the EU-wide reduction target is 40% and the target for Finland 50%. In the renewable energy legislation, our target for final consumption is 51%, while the EU average is 42.5%. And then on the national climate change mitigation objectives and preparation of actions. At the national level, the Finnish government is working to accelerate emission reduction measures. Our climate policy is defined and mitigation actions presented in national strategies, programs and plans, which the most relevant for climate change mitigation were finalized in 2022. And these are the National Energy and Climate Strategy, medium-term climate change policy plan, in which focus is on the effort sharing sector, and then the climate plan for the land use sector. Our Climate Act, which originates from year 2015, was revised in 2022. This revision included a carbon neutrality target for 2035. Our national target for 2050 was updated and new targets for 2030 and 2040 included. The scope of the Act was extended to cover the LULUCF sector, and a target for the strengthening of carbon sinks was also added. And I'll come back to these targets in the next slide. So the Climate Act sets out national targets related to climate change. Finland aims to be carbon neutral by 2035 and carbon negative soon after that by accelerating emission reduction measures and strengthening carbon sinks. Additional measures for achieving carbon neutrality are proposed in the new strategies and plans mentioned as presented in the previous slide. The Climate Act specifies 3 emission reduction targets, which are 60% by 2030, 80% by 2040, and 90%, but aiming for 95% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. And as mentioned, also the strengthening of carbon sinks was added to the Act in this new version of 2022. And then finally, Finland is of course also committed to EU's climate neutrality target by 2050. Then coming to some examples of key policies and measures. The EU ETS is the instrument for reducing emissions in energy production and industry sectors, and that has been also described before. For promoting renewable energy, there are inter alia premium schemes and investment subsidies, as well as blending obligation for biofuels in transport sector. For improving energy efficiency, we have introduced inter alia energy audits, energy efficiency agreements, and minimum standards for new buildings. Implementation of the EU's landfill directive and national legislation and strategies are aiming to reduce the amount of waste generated and minimize the amount of waste disposed at landfill. We also have stringent F-gas regulation in place. With measures projection, turning now to this slide. Here we first of all can see the latest greenhouse gas inventory data, and then the with measures projection up to 2035. It shows that significant emission reductions will continue both under the EU ETS and the effort sharing decision sectors. Also, a few remarks on the successes and challenges. Finland's energy sector emissions per capita are higher than in the EU on average due to cold climate, energy-intensive industry, and low population density, and therefore long traveling and transport distances. Energy sector emissions have been reduced significantly since 1990, even though energy consumption has increased. Emissions from the waste sector have gone down 66% since 1990. And waste legislation has had a key role here, especially by significantly reducing landfilling. And also a look at the historic development of renewables with measures. The increased use of renewable energy sources compared to 1990 has increasingly replaced fossil fuels as and is the main reason for the reduced emissions, despite the growth in energy consumption. In 1990, the share of renewable energy in total energy consumption was just 18%. Since then, the share has grown steadily and the use of fossil fuels decreased. The share of renewable energy sources from the final energy consumption grew to 42% in 2022. The ban we have on the use of hard coal for energy production, which will enter into force in 2029, is already now decreasing coal consumption. Then continuing with successes and challenges in implementing our climate change policies. Emissions in transport sector were 16% lower in 2022 than in 1990. Positive developments in the recent years include, for example, the number of electric cars has increased steadily, and this trend is expected to continue. The distribution obligation for biofuels has reduced emissions from transport. The blending obligation will gradually increase, which will further reduce emissions in the coming years. Emissions from agriculture sector are hard to abate. Emissions in 2021 were 12% lower than in 1990, but they have remained almost constant between 2005 and 2022. The amount of synthetic fertilizers used has decreased by 36% from 1990 to 2021 and is the most important factor for the reduced emissions. So thank you very much for listening. This was the presentation from Finland. I hope you have found this useful and look forward to the multilateral assessment event in Dubai. Thank you.